Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz vocalist and poet Lisa B. She is promoting her latest 2018 record, her sixth, called I Get a Kick, Cole Porter Reimagined. So her mother wrote poetry and her father was a serious fan of avant-garde jazz. Many legendary musicians like Elvin Jones were family friends. Early on, she studied classical piano and was steeped in jazz. Over the years, she has performed at more than 80 venues in the San Francisco Bay Area, New York, Los Angeles, and elsewhere. She has done so much and feels like she is just getting started. So get to know her and dig this interview, my friends.
So, Lisa, thank you for taking a minute out for me today. I appreciate it.
Oh, I'm thrilled to. I've been enjoying your previous conversations, listening to them on YouTube.
Oh, cool. Very good. Let me go ahead and start off here, and let's hit kind of what's been going on with your life with the new album, with the Cole Porter Reimagined. Talk to me about this project, how it came about, and how you ultimately feel about the final product.
The street date is coming up, January 19th, although it's on pre-order various places, including Amazon, so people can go there or order it directly from my website. It's a real departure for me. For one thing, it's my sixth record, but it's my first on the Jazz Media label, and that's really exciting to have the distribution and the support from them. I'm really excited about that. And about the project, it's also a departure because my previous five records, although I did do sort of reimagined covers, to some extent they were mainly my original music. And this is all diving into the sensibility of Cole Porter, who's such an amazing writer, and coming up with some arrangements that have never been done before for his music, and also in some of them integrating spoken word and vocalese, because I have a background actually as a literary poet, so that's kind of a start about it. I could talk about it for the next 10 minutes nonstop, but it's probably better to have more of a conversation with you.
Sure, yeah, no, and that's the thing. You know, Cole Porter is always kind of a standard in the world of jazz to cover. What do you think is so alluring about him and what he did that's been so timeless in the world of music?
You know, he's unusual in the Great American Songbook. For one thing, being a very wealthy Gentile man. That's interesting about his background. Also, it's pretty certain that he was gay, and he was in the closet about that. Although he had a social life that wasn't known to the public. In terms of his work, he was unusual in being both a lyricist and a composer. You know, usually we see, Rodgers and Hart or other sort of duos, and one person handles lyrics and one the music. And Cole Porter did everything himself. His sensibility also is unusual in that you feel, he's got this tremendous wit. So his lyrics just scan beautifully and are really, poetry of, even though they deal with a lot of current events, it feels very timeless and snappy. I get a kick out of you. But there are also tunes of tremendous longing and heartbreak. So you always feel this sort of dichotomy in his work of hot and cool, or heartache and wisecrack. The very contemporary sensibility of sort of being the outsider on the inside. That's kind of one thing we experience as postmodern people, that we can feel very alone in a crowd. And you often get that sense in Cole Porter's work that he, despite all of his advantages of being this high society person and Broadway insider, that he was very much a private person with a great deal of suffering. And so, that's really meaty stuff to express as a singer and a fellow songwriter.
So let me get into your life a little bit. The ultimate of each of us human beings is that we have the zygote split. We get a little bit from our mother and father. And culturally speaking, the cultural zygote for you looks like a pretty good split. Your mom wrote poetry, and your dad was seriously in the avant-garde jazz realm and knew a lot of people. Jackie McLean, Elvin Jones. There's a lot of history there. So do you think you got a really good mix of both of your parents that's led you to where you're at as an artist today?
Yeah, I do think. It's unusual. Many folks I know sort of rebel culturally against their parents. but I never did. It just meant I had to rebel later for other reasons, but they're my great friends. But yeah, I feel very lucky that I was reading, Howl by Allen Ginsberg at 10 years old, because that was what was on the shelves at home, and that I grew up hearing John Coltrane in the womb, as well as, musical theater and a lot of other stuff. So it was really nice not to have to go out and discover all that by myself. I feel like it gave me a really rich head start, and also to be validated that making art and music and poetry is a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So did you grow up in Oakland?
No, I was born in Southern California and then spent 5 years in Long Island and then came back to Silicon Valley when I was 10. So I've been in the Bay Area since then. So I sort of have those New York zygotes, as you put it, and but a kind of a Bay Area, I guess, sort of sense of possibility, maybe. That's one thing I would say about it.
It's interesting. We're at Long Island.
East Williston, and I don't know what that's like now.
Well, my dad grew up in Babylon. He was born in Brooklyn but raised in Babylon, so there's a little bit of Long Island in me as well. So
it kind of sounded like that.
Okay, good. Well, I retain those New York roots without living there. I've been in Kansas City all of my life, so it's good that I've gotten a little bit of that east. So yeah, it's good.
Well, I mean, that's like, the gateway. Actually, that's, the immigrant experience is, I don't know if that's in your background, but that's partly what I express in my take on I Happen to Like New York. That's one of the tunes I do. And usually it's done in this very bombastic, fabulous versions by Liza Minnelli or Judy Garland. But I took a more sort of quiet, even Steve Reich sort of feeling with the modulation. But I have this spoken word intro called Sonia and Solomon about my Russian grandparents and their first approaching Ellis Island and all their expectations about coming to New York. We need immigrants in our country. It's a pretty current topic, so.
Well, yeah, my family came from Italy, so yeah, that's why they came to Ellis Island, and that's kind of how everything started. And people often wonder, how did Domino end up in Kansas City? Well, my dad joined the Air Force and got stationed here and fell in love, and here we all are. So it's kind of how it all happened.
I've never been to Kansas City, so I'll have to talk to you offline about, how I can set up a gig there.
Yeah, absolutely. So getting back to your life, it must have been quite a thing to remember sitting on Elvin Jones's lap at a party and just being around jazz musicians at such an early age. How do you think that affected you, just, I don't know, being an artist?
Yeah, I had a sort of a mix of stuff, and those were pretty big knees, I will say, that Elvin possessed. In some ways it was normal to me, but it was also different from the experience of my fellow suburban, classmates as little girls. Their parents were not as deeply involved in the sort of creative ferment of jazz. And I also studied piano. It was kind of silly. My dad said, well, I could try and get Mal Waldron to give you lessons. And I said, no, I'm too scared. So, there was a shyness, and now I'm like, what was I thinking? And, Jackie McLean would show me certain things on the piano, and he was great. He and his wife, Dolly, were, best friends with my parents. It was also intimidating for me, I have to say, because of the emotional intensity of the music was a bit much for me to process. In terms of something like, the Art Ensemble of Chicago or, really avant-garde music. But we did also listen to a lot of singers. So Carmen McRae was really a big influence. Sheila Jordan, that sort of branch of vocal jazz where lyric interpretation was really one of the top priorities in what the singer was doing. And that really spoke to me as a very verbal person, too. So it was fabulous, but it was intense, in short.
Yeah, I would imagine so. Jazz is one thing, but avant-garde is another on a young brain. I would imagine that's pretty intense. So did you always know that you were going to get into the arts and be a poet and be a singer? Was that something that was on your radar always?
Yeah. What I identified most with was being a writer. and in fact being a poet from a young age. And I just had that. And, I think as sensitive people, many people who become artists do so because perhaps their overall instrument is a little bit more sensitive. And, we need to do something with all of these empathies and impressions and what we're just picking up. And so I'm glad that, in my early writing that my folks said, yeah, this is wonderful, keep doing this.
It seems in the realm of art and all of the mediums that we consume on a kind of a mass basis, it's always about writing, whether it's a script or it's a good sitcom or a good show, there's always good writing. And this is my question for you as a singer. Has it helped you tremendously to understand music better because you've had to hone your craft of writing?
Yeah. I think there's a couple different skills here. Certainly as a singer, one thing that singers get to do is, sing words. I work with fabulous people. I generally like to pick people who also like to pay attention to the lyric, and in fact, doing In the Still of the Night, for instance, I was not going to do this upbeat, optimistic version because to me the lyric is, in the still of the night as I gaze out my window, I'm wondering, do you still love me? So the lyric points me in a certain direction with the arrangement. And, and then becoming, first I was a literary poet, really. Then after that I started to sing and become a songwriter. So I was aware that writing lyrics and music is really different than writing poetry. For instance, poetry, you want it to be the whole symphony, the whole orchestra, everything, the scenery, the costumes. But when you're writing words with music, you need to leave some more space for the music to do quite a lot. And then, writing music is different, but certainly having a sense of the structure, the dynamics, the dramatic tension and release. Yeah, you totally learn that as a writer, and as well as a musician. But when you have to compose that, it really puts it front and center. What is the structure here?
So when you first started performing live, were you nervous, or has this been a natural thing for you to be on stage?
I started performing live as a poet, and so I gained my confidence in that, although in some ways you could say it's more scary because you're just standing up with your words in a bookstore. And, can you carry the crowd? And, poets actually are famously terrible readers many times because they're private people and they're introverts and they may not be performers. It reawoke the performing bug in me. But as opposed to being a musical performer, when I was performing work that was written on the page and it was, quote, just words, I didn't really have to recreate it in the moment. I'd perfect it behind the scenes. I'd get feedback. It was pretty much done. I was confident. And then all I had to do was present it like an actor. Whereas as a singer, I'm really recreating the art in the moment as well as conveying a musical composition. So I'm still nervous. Where's my body today? Where's my throat today? If someone just said something mean to me right before I went on stage, my throat's going to be higher. You know what I mean? And the tone's going to feel a little different. So it's been more of a process of being in the moment. Where are my tools in this moment and what can I do with them in the moment? And, jazz is very much about being in the moment and creating in the moment. Yeah, I'm still nervous, but, we learn to use it. Like I've told folks that I've taught, if you're not nervous, there's something wrong, right? You want to use that adrenaline. That's what we learn. It's better than refusing to perform in despair, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So you've been to over 80 venues all over the place. You've released 6 albums. You teach. How do you feel about your career?
Oh, honestly, I feel like I'm just getting started. I've mainly performed, in the Bay Area, to some extent in New York and L.A. I did have a book of, on the poetry front, I published a book, almost 30 years ago with Wesleyan University Press. I got a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship in creative writing, but I sort of put all that aside to some extent to become a singer. So in a way, I sort of started over again in my, mid to late 20s as a jazz singer. So I'm actually, this new record, which is, just officially coming out next week, because it's the music of Cole Porter rather than presenting so much of my originals, I'm hoping it's going to be a big step up in terms of festivals and audiences and consumers.
We've already covered, it's no surprise that you've been around a lot of big musicians when you were very young and even in your life through your parents. But what jazz concerts have you seen that really left a very deep impression on you?
I would say seeing the Art Ensemble of Chicago various times, in San Francisco, at Stanford University, when I was really young. Their motto was "Great Black Music, Ancient to the Future." I'm not black, but I'm working in of course, largely black art form, certainly in its roots, or you could say also with a strong Jewish influence in the Great American Songbook. But the Art Ensemble, they did all eras of music, and they were also very theatrical, with the painted faces. Joseph Jarman was a poet as well, and they were just mind-blowing in terms of the highest level of craft and also the highest commitment to creativity and improvisation, and we can do anything.
Yeah. So what similarities do poetry and jazz have to you? What are they synonymous, or do you think there's enough of a difference that there's similarities? I don't want to make it too confusing, but what is it about the nature of poetry and jazz that works so well together?
Well, I have to say I actually strongly dislike it when poets get up there and kind of blow over some sort of musical background. I mean, that was a cool moment, with the beat poets and beyond, where poets started at that cultural moment working with jazz musicians. But I like to approach it differently, where I actually, for instance, when I do Night and Day, I do a version called Night and Day, parentheses, The Cat Goddess. Actually, there were two tunes on this record that are remastered from a record I did 10 years ago called What's New Pussycat. And I know you're a cat lover, Joe. That's what I think, by the way.
Yes.
But anyway, I compose, I'm doing Night and Day, and then I'll interleave a section of spoken word in that. That's a part of the arrangement. So the way I approach spoken word is generally it's more or poetry integrated into the composition. Although I did do a version of Naima called Trains Ride with Naima in the background, but the language, I composed that I wrote that poem, Trains Ride, actually when I was teaching poetry at San Francisco State, but I heard Naima in my head and I heard the bar lines going by as I was writing it. So I like to approach it in a very interconnected way in terms of what my thing is. I think that certainly in general, jazz has a lot of freedom and twists and turns of structure, and modern contemporary poetry offers that. Most people aren't writing in rhyme. You can, there's a lot of internal music that can be very complicated and exciting in different ways, and jazz has that too. But it's kind of funny because then when you shift to writing lyrics, you're sort of back to, rhyming, meter and rhyme. And, most contemporary poets aren't writing in meter and rhyme like contemporary lyricists are. But, there's a lot of freedom in both art forms, basically.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this specifically about jazz. Why do you love jazz?
Part of it is that I feel like I was born into the jazz tribe. If you're not born into it, jazz welcomes you into its tribe. I mean, it's still, don't you feel that, Joe? It's very much a community.
Yes.
For better or for worse, we're not generally touring in big stadiums like the pop stars of today. Although, I think back in the day, Weather Report and Miles aspired to that and got a taste of that. But we're not in this pop realm of personality. It's really about the music. And when you talk to other musicians, they use that phrase, the music. The music took me. It's this incredible rich tradition. So the other thing is it's jazz is about innovation and tradition. You need both. And there's always that tension and that churning of working with the tradition and then creating new things within the tradition. And jazz is sort of like, it's such an American art form. Just if we can say that the U.S. is enlivened by all the immigrant cultures it accepts and is transformed, jazz is like that too. You can pull in anything into jazz, world music, bossa, the whole Brazilian thing, the Afro-Cuban thing, the beat, now hip-hop, and it can still be jazz, and jazz will absorb and recreate those musical genres and streams. You know what I mean? So
yeah.
Jazz is the ultimate creative field for a musician to work in, musically and culturally.
I always ask the question, and I'm not doing this because of that atrocious quote that said jazz is dead, but I'm looking more at coming from the narrative of talking to older musicians that are sometimes, I think, a little bit worried that we won't have that reverence for the past and the stories and the lore that was jazz when it was really big, all the way up until today. Do you think it's silly to think that jazz won't thrive on into the future, that that's even a valid question?
I think yes and no. I think that we're in a moment where we've seen the academization, if that's the right way to pronounce it, of jazz in a way that we hadn't seen before. And we've seen that in poetry, too, where, there's thousands, literally, of MFA programs that students can go to learn how to play jazz. And that never existed before. Then again, the club scene is really struggling. So before, someone could kind of get their chops by playing a lot in clubs. Now I see a lot of people instead doing that in university programs and college programs. So I'm glad that there are those institutions to support jazz, but it's a very different feeling. But, we're also in an era where you don't need the gatekeeper of the record label. Everyone can put out a CD, so it both provides creative opportunity for folks, and floods the market with everything. So it makes it hard for the consumer to find. I don't think jazz will ever die. I would hope that people who come through other, the blues or pop or whatever, they get a little bored with more predictable structures, and jazz is out there to be discovered. I think that creative musicians will always find it or find a little taste of it.
Let me ask you this. Everyone has a version of who you are, your family, your friends, your fans, business associates. But let me ask you this. Who do you think you are? When you wake up and you face today, who are you?
I listened to, I think you asked, I was listening to the interview with, I think it's Sean Eeg. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right. And I was thinking, I hope he doesn't ask me that question. That's one of the things I try and be conscious of, because I am such a sensitive person, and I also work as a professional psychic. That's one of my current day jobs, is I want to work on channeling me. It's very easy in this environment that we're in, where we're flooded with information, to pick up a lot of other stuff. So there's that consciousness that I recognize. I know when I'm in the groove of myself. This might sound kind of funny, but I'll look around at reality and I'll feel this sort of honeycomb pungency and calm to it. And that's like a marker for me of, yes, I'm in my own consciousness, and there's a sense of comfort and also paradise. I think when we're really running ourselves, one way we know that is that it feels easy. It feels good. But I have so many sides to myself. I mean, I'm, a very entitled person who will fight for my rights and be sure that I deserve, the best table at a restaurant. I mean, that's kind of a classic Jewish cliche. But I'm also the very advocate person who's going around telling everyone that, no, you have to fight for your rights and call the rent control board. And, I'm the private introvert poet, and then I'm also a performer. But I do feel a little bit at war sometimes with the poet versus the performer, the person that wants to make everything perfect in private and mine my sort of rich personal reality, but then who really wants to get out and sing it and show it to people. I just wish that the other part of what we have to do today as musicians, which is all the self-hustle, you really have to do a lot of self-promotion all the time. I'm pretty good at that too, but, there's a little bit too much of that and not as much of the just creation and performing as I would like.
Absolutely. Well, I think, Lisa, that wraps everything up. I think I saved the hardest question for last. So thank you for opening up about your jazz world, your poetry world, and everything in between. I appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. It's been really great to talk with you.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in Oakland, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Lisa for her time, her music, and her stories. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz@youtube.com. And for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.